In the early months of the Second World War, the Mediterranean Sea was a chessboard of empires. Control of its waters meant access to oil routes, colonial territories, and vital supply lines stretching from Britain to India and beyond. At the center of this struggle stood Italy's powerful Regia Marina. Its fleet anchored confidently at the southern port of Taranto. The harbor, heavily defended and thought secure, sheltered battleships that symbolized fascist Italy's naval ambition. Yet on the night of November 11th to 12th, 1940, that confidence would shatter. In a daring and unprecedented strike, British carrier-based aircraft attacked the Italian fleet in Taranto harbor, crippling multiple battleships in a matter of hours. The raid would demonstrate that naval aviation had fundamentally changed warfare at sea. More than a year before Pearl Harbor, Taranto proved that a fleet anchored in port was vulnerable to air power. Mediterranean tensions. When Italy entered the war in June 1940, the Mediterranean instantly became a critical theater. Britain relied on the Suez Canal to connect with its Eastern Empire. Italian bases in Libya and the Dodecanese Islands threatened British shipping routes. The Italian fleet, one of the largest in Europe, boasted modern battleships, cruisers, and destroyers capable of challenging British dominance. The Royal Navy, though experienced and battle-hardened, faced numerical challenges. Britain's resources were stretched thin across the Atlantic and North Sea. Any direct confrontation with Italy's fleet risked severe losses. Yet allowing the Italian Navy free rein would endanger British convoys supplying Malta and North Africa. British naval commanders recognized that a conventional surface battle could be costly and uncertain. Instead, they considered a bold alternative, striking the Italian fleet while it lay at anchor. Such an attack required innovation and risk. Aircraft carriers were still relatively new instruments of war. Many traditional naval strategists believed battleships remained supreme, but aviation was rapidly changing those assumptions. The vision of a carrier strike, the idea of attacking Taranto, had circulated within British planning circles even before the war. Intelligence indicated that much of Italy's battle fleet frequently concentrated in Taranto's inner harbor. The port's shallow waters were believed to provide natural defense against torpedoes, which typically required deeper depths to arm properly. Nets and anti-aircraft batteries added further protection. Yet British planners saw possibility rather than impossibility. Engineers modified torpedoes with wooden fins and specialized settings, enabling them to run effectively in shallow water. The aircraft chosen for the mission were Fairey Swordfish biplanes, slow, fabric-covered aircraft that appeared almost obsolete compared to sleek modern fighters. But their simplicity was an advantage. They were reliable, capable of carrying torpedoes or bombs, and able to operate from short carrier decks. The carrier selected for the strike was HMS Illustrious. From its deck would launch fewer than 24 aircraft. The scale was modest, the ambition enormous. Planning the operation required meticulous coordination. Pilots rehearsed night approaches and torpedo drops. Navigators studied charts of Taranto's harbor layout. Intelligence gathered details on ship positions and defensive emplacements. Timing was critical. The attack would occur at night to maximize surprise. 2 waves of aircraft would approach in staggered formation. Some would carry torpedoes aimed at battleships. Others would drop flares and bombs to illuminate targets and disrupt defenses. It was a gamble. Losses were expected. The Swordfish aircraft were slow and vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire. If Italian searchlights and guns reacted quickly, the raid could turn disastrous. Yet the alternative, allowing the Italian fleet to operate unchallenged, posed greater strategic risk. The night of November 11, as darkness fell over the Mediterranean, HMS Illustrious positioned itself roughly 170 miles from Taranto. The sea was calm, the sky clear. At approximately 9 p.m., the first wave of Swordfish lifted off into the night, engines humming steadily. Flying low to avoid detection, the aircraft approached the harbor. Soon flares ignited overhead, casting eerie light across anchored ships. Italian gunners scrambled to respond as torpedoes splashed into the water. The shallow harbor did not save the battleships. Modified torpedoes struck with devastating effect. The battleship Comte di Cavour was hit and eventually sunk in shallow water. Littorio, one of Italy's most modern ships, suffered multiple torpedo impacts. Caio de Uio was also severely damaged. Explosions lit the harbor. Fires burned. Confusion reigned. Anti-aircraft guns roared, but the attackers pressed on. The second wave followed shortly after midnight, compounding the damage. Bombs struck cruisers and fuel facilities. Within hours, 3 Italian battleships were disabled, half of Italy's capital ship strength. Remarkably, British losses were minimal. Only 2 aircraft were shot down. Shockwaves across navies. The result stunned naval observers worldwide. A small force of carrier-based aircraft had neutralized a powerful battle fleet at anchor. The attack demonstrated that air power could project decisive force against even heavily defended ports. For Britain, Taranto provided immediate strategic relief. Italian naval power was temporarily crippled, reducing the threat to British convoys. The psychological effect was equally significant. The Royal Navy had proven its adaptability and boldness. For other nations, including Japan and the United States, the implications were profound. Naval planners studied the raid carefully. It showed that shallow harbors were not immune to torpedo attack, and that surprise aerial strikes could alter the balance of power in a single night. A turning point at sea, the Battle of Taranto, did not end naval warfare in the Mediterranean. Italy would repair some damaged ships, and fighting would continue fiercely. Yet the raid marked a decisive shift in naval doctrine. The aircraft carrier had demonstrated its potential as the dominant capital ship of modern warfare. Battleships, once symbols of unchallenged sea power, were revealed as vulnerable when stationary and exposed. The age of aviation had arrived. Taranto was not yet recognized as a revolution, but history would remember it as a preview of the future. The harbor attack, executed with daring and precision, foreshadowed events that would soon unfold across the globe. More than a year later, another fleet would burn in another harbor. But on that November night in 1940, it was Taranto that first revealed the new face of naval war. The success of the first torpedo strikes at Taranto did not immediately silence the harbor. Instead, chaos deepened. Searchlights stabbed at the sky. Anti-aircraft batteries thundered in every direction. Italian sailors rushed to battle stations, struggling to comprehend how a small number of slow-moving aircraft had penetrated what was believed to be one of the most secure anchorages in the Mediterranean. The harbor itself became a surreal landscape of flame and smoke. Oil burned on the water's surface. Ships listed at unnatural angles. The battleship Comte di Cavour struck below the waterline, settled into the shallow mud. Though the harbor prevented it from sinking completely beneath the waves, the damage proved beyond repair during the war. Littorio, pride of the Italian fleet, suffered multiple torpedo hits that tore open its hull. Caio de Uio was also badly damaged and forced aground to prevent capsizing. The British pilots who delivered these blows faced intense danger. Flying open-cockpit swordfish aircraft at low altitude required steady nerves and precise control. A glare of explosions illuminated them as targets. Yet many pressed home their attacks, despite heavy fire. Observers later noted the extraordinary calm with which the crews described their experiences, an indication of both professionalism and the unique atmosphere of naval aviation at the time. The Italian response in the immediate aftermath, Italian authorities worked feverishly to salvage what they could. Damage control teams pumped water from flooded compartments. Tugboats maneuvered crippled vessels toward shallower ground. Engineers assessed structural damage under the constant fear of further attack. The psychological shock, however, was harder to repair than steel plating. The Regia Marina had been confident in Taranto's defenses. Anti-torpedo nets, barrage balloons, and layered gun emplacements were expected to deter any serious assault. Yet the British had exploited gaps, particularly the incomplete deployment of torpedo nets and the underestimated vulnerability of shallow water. Italian naval commanders now faced a difficult reality. With half of their battleship strength disabled, operational flexibility was drastically reduced. While not permanently destroyed, the damaged ships required months of repair. During that period, Britain gained breathing space across the Mediterranean. Strategic ripple effects, the immediate military consequences of Taranto, were significant but not absolute. Italy still possessed a formidable navy. However, the balance of power shifted enough to influence subsequent engagements. British convoys to Malta and North Africa encountered reduced capital ship opposition. The Royal Navy could operate with greater confidence, even if the Mediterranean remained contested. More importantly, Taranto demonstrated a concept rather than merely a tactical victory. It showed that aircraft carriers could strike decisive blows without direct battleship engagement. The traditional doctrine of naval warfare, centered on heavily armored ships exchanging broadsides, had been undermined. Naval thinkers around the world took notice. In Japan, observers studied the Taranto raid carefully. Japanese naval officers analyzed British torpedo modifications and shallow water techniques. The parallels between Taranto and another Pacific harbor were not lost on them. If a small British carrier force could cripple the Italian fleet, what might a larger, more coordinated aerial assault accomplish elsewhere? Across the Atlantic, American naval planners also examined the operation. Though the United States had not yet entered the war, the implications were clear. Anchored fleets were vulnerable. Harbor defenses required reconsideration. Carrier aviation demanded expansion. Taranto became a case study proof that innovation and bold execution could overcome numerical disadvantage. The human dimension of the raid, beyond strategy and doctrine, lay the human stories of that night. Italian sailors found themselves fighting fires, sealing compartments, and tending to wounded comrades. Many had joined the Navy with visions of open-sea battle, not surprise aerial assault under cover of darkness. British crews aboard HMS Illustrious awaited the return of their aircraft with anxious anticipation. Each landing was a small triumph. Pilots recounted flares drifting down like artificial moons, the sudden flash of torpedo impact, and the roar of defensive guns. For them, the raid combined terror and exhilaration, a mixture common in pioneering military operations. The limited British losses were remarkable given the risks. 2 aircraft were shot down, and several crew members were killed or captured. Considering the scale of damage inflicted, the casualty ratio underscored the operation's effectiveness. Lessons learned: military innovation often emerges from necessity. Britain, under severe strain in 1940, could not afford prolonged surface battles with the Italian fleet. The decision to rely on a small number of carrier aircraft was both pragmatic and visionary. The technical modifications made to torpedoes proved crucial. Without them, the shallow waters of Taranto might indeed have protected the anchored ships. This adaptation highlighted the importance of engineering ingenuity alongside tactical daring. Additionally, the coordination between reconnaissance, timing, and night navigation demonstrated the growing sophistication of carrier operations. Night attacks, once considered impractical, were shown to be feasible with proper preparation. For Italy, Taranto prompted reassessment of harbor defenses and fleet dispersal strategies. Concentrating ships in a single anchorage had provided a tempting target. Dispersal and mobility became more pressing considerations. A foreshadowing of the Pacific, though Taranto was fought in the Mediterranean, its shadow stretched toward the Pacific. The raid offered a blueprint, one that others would refine on a larger scale. Aircraft carriers were no longer experimental adjuncts to fleets. They were instruments of decisive power. The similarities between Taranto and later harbor attacks were striking. Nighttime or surprise approach, torpedo strikes in shallow water, coordinated waves of aircraft, and the aim of neutralizing capital ships before they could sortie. Taranto's scale was smaller, but its implications were vast. A war transformed the Battle of Taranto, signaled a transformation in naval warfare. It marked the ascendancy of air power over traditional sea power. Battleships remained formidable, but their dominance was no longer unquestioned. The Mediterranean campaign would continue with fierce engagements at sea and on land. Yet the memory of that November night lingered. It reshaped planning rooms and war colleges. It altered procurement priorities and fleet doctrines. Taranto did not end the era of the battleship overnight, but it accelerated its decline. As 1940 drew to a close, few outside naval circles fully grasped the raid's significance. But those who studied it understood. A revolution had occurred under the cover of darkness. The world would soon witness an even larger demonstration of that revolution. When we think of turning points in World War II, massive clashes like Stalingrad or D-Day often come to mind. But what if I told you that one of the most revolutionary moments of the war happened in the quiet darkness of a Mediterranean harbor, carried out by a handful of slow, old-fashioned-looking airplanes? This is the story of the Battle of Taranto, a raid so audacious and so ahead of its time that it literally wrote the blueprint for Pearl Harbor. In November 1940, the world was a grim place for Britain. France had fallen, the Blitz was raging, and the Axis powers seemed unstoppable. The Royal Navy, though powerful, was stretched thin across the globe. In the Mediterranean, the Italian fleet, the Regia Marina, posed a formidable threat from its main base at Taranto, in the heel of Italy. These powerful battleships could dominate the sea lanes, threatening vital British convoys to Egypt and Malta. Something had to be done, but a head-on naval battle was too risky. The British needed a different kind of weapon, a different kind of plan. The answer came from the air, specifically from the flight deck of the aircraft carrier HMS Illustrious. The plan, codenamed Operation Judgment, was breathtakingly bold. A nighttime air attack on the heavily defended Taranto harbor. The weapon of choice? The fairy swordfish. To call these planes antiquated would be an understatement. They were biplanes, covered in fabric, with open cockpits and a top speed that would make a modern car yawn. They were nicknamed string bags because they looked like they were held together with string and wire. Yet, these vulnerable-looking machines were about to change naval warfare forever. The challenges were immense. They had to fly over 100 miles in total darkness, navigate precisely, and then dive into a harbor bristling with anti-aircraft guns and protected by barrage balloons. But the biggest problem was the water itself. Taranto's harbor was shallow, too shallow for standard aerial torpedoes, which would just dive into the mud. So, British engineers got creative. They developed special modifications, adding wooden fins to the torpedoes to ensure they ran true in the shallow depths. This small innovation would have massive consequences. On the night of November 11th, 21 swordfish took off from HMS Illustrious. The first wave, led by Lieutenant Commander Kenneth Williamson, roared over the harbor just before 11 p.m. The surprise was total. Flares dropped from the sky, illuminating the anchored Italian battleships like giant targets in a shooting gallery. The swordfish pilots, some barely in their 20s, braved a storm of anti-aircraft fire, swooping low over the water to drop their specially modified torpedoes. Explosions ripped through the night. The battleship Comte de Cavour was hit and began to sink. Another, the Littorio, was struck by multiple torpedoes, tearing huge holes in its hull. An hour later, the second wave arrived to finish the job. More torpedoes found their mark, and bombs rained down on cruisers and destroyers. By the time the last swordfish turned for home, the heart of the Italian fleet was a scene of devastation. 3 battleships were out of action, and the balance of naval power in the Mediterranean had shifted in a single night. All for the cost of just 2 British aircraft. The cost imbalance was staggering. A few inexpensive biplanes had crippled some of the most powerful and expensive warships on the planet. For Italy, the raid was a profound shock. The fleet was forced to move to safer, more distant ports, reducing its threat to British shipping. For Britain, it was a desperately needed victory, a beacon of hope in a very dark year. It proved that innovation and daring could triumph over superior numbers. But the story of Taranto doesn't end there. Its most significant legacy would unfold a year later, halfway across the world. In Tokyo, the Imperial Japanese Navy studied the Taranto raid with intense interest. Here was proof that a fleet could be crippled at anchor. They analyzed the British tactics, the nighttime coordination, and especially the solution to the shallow water torpedo problem. The parallels to their own strategic dilemma were undeniable. They, too, had a rival fleet anchored in a shallow harbor that they needed to neutralize, the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched its own surprise attack. It was Taranto on a massive scale. Hundreds of aircraft, not dozens. But the core concept was the same. Waves of carrier-based planes, torpedoes modified for shallow water, and the goal of achieving a knockout blow against a sleeping fleet. As battleships burned in Pearl Harbor, the echoes of Taranto were unmistakable. The attack that drew America into the war was in many ways a perfected version of the British original. This is why Taranto is often called Pearl Harbor before Pearl Harbor. Beyond its influence on Japan, Taranto marked the beginning of the end for an entire era of naval warfare. For centuries, the battleship was the undisputed queen of the seas, a symbol of national power. Its massive guns and thick armor were the ultimate expression of maritime might. Taranto proved that this floating fortress was vulnerable. An aircraft, launched from a carrier hundreds of miles away, could deliver a fatal blow. After Taranto and Pearl Harbor, the world's navies rushed to build more aircraft carriers. The battleship was relegated to a supporting role, providing anti-aircraft fire or shore bombardment. The new centerpiece of the fleet was the carrier, a mobile airbase that could project power across vast distances. The torch had been passed. The future of naval combat would be decided not by dueling cannons, but by aircraft fighting over the horizon. Think about the men who flew those swordfish. They were flying slow, vulnerable planes with open cockpits, exposed to the cold, the wind, and a sky full of enemy fire. Their success wasn't just about technology. It was about immense courage, skill, and discipline. They navigated by moonlight and sheer nerve, carrying the weight of a nation's hopes on their fabric wings. On the other side, Italian sailors fought heroically in the chaos, battling fires and floods to save their ships and their comrades. Behind every strategic decision and historical turning point, there are always stories of individual bravery and sacrifice. Today, the Battle of Taranto is often overshadowed by the larger events it helped to inspire. But in military academies and naval colleges, it's studied as a textbook example of innovation, surprise, and the transformational power of air power. It was a hinge moment, small in scale but vast in its consequences. It showed that the future doesn't always belong to the biggest and strongest, but sometimes to the smartest and the bravest. The fires that lit up Taranto Harbor that November night did more than just damage a few ships. They illuminated a fundamental shift in warfare. They signaled that the age of the battleship was over, and the age of the aircraft carrier had begun. In the quiet darkness over southern Italy, on the canvas wings of a few old biplanes, the future of war at sea arrived. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this piece of forgotten history, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like it.